Hello there and welcome to our All 24 news special coverage with me, Karim Zachary. On the occasion of NAKBA Day, today's special coverage is dedicated to SHIREEN Abu AKLEH, Al Jazeera's journalist who was shot dead by Zionist forces in the occupied West Bank. SHIREEN Abu AKLEH, the daughter and voice of Palestine, was shot in the head by Zionist forces on Wednesday morning while on assignment in Jenin for doing nothing but her job. A veteran journalist, a name known across Palestine and the Arab world, SHIREEN was the voice of Palestine who shed light on all Palestinian people. Her death has left a shocking wave throughout Palestine and the world. Having reported for Al Jazeera channel for more than 20 years, SHIREEN was committed to the core of her job, telling the stories of those who don't have a voice. A great storyteller for almost 3 decades, heard in every home in Palestine, despite the many challenges of living and working in what is the longest occupation in history. SHIREEN never gave up on telling the truth. She was the voice of the voiceless, embodying values and principles until the day she was brutally murdered by the Zionist forces. Now, the whole world is calling to bring to justice the ones responsible for her murder. To discuss more about the blatant and brutal murder of SHIREEN, as well as the Palestinian cause, or whether the Zionist state is indeed a rogue state, I am joined live via Skype by John Phoenix, international relations expert, founder of SHOA from England, along with James Dorsey, geopolitical analyst and senior fellow at Middle East Institute from Singapore. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A short break and we start the discussion. Mr. John Phoenix, despite wearing a vest that has the word press written on it, or maybe even because of it, SHIREEN was shot to the head. According to eyewitnesses and those accompanying the journalist, the army didn't warn them nor ask them to leave and simply started shooting them. And they added further that there was no Palestinian resistance at the scene. Why would they shoot, I mean? How can you read this brutal act by the Zionist entity?
Well, just to remind your listeners, this is not the first act. Obviously, this is a common practice by the Zionist regime. Till her death, so far, 55 Palestinian journalists been killed in Gaza, West Bank. If you remember the Great March 2017 on the Gaza border, the journalists been shot to their heads, and a lot of the Palestinian journalists in West Bank been arrested and tortured. The only difference in this case that she was privileged, that she works for a big network called Al Jazeera, and Al Jazeera obviously had a full coverage over here, killing all over the world. There is monitoring on the Palestinians' youth websites, Facebooks, all this social media being monitored by the Zionist entity, and people who dare to criticize their brutal regime and their any human treatment of the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank. They have been arrested and tortured, and they're obviously with the help and the support of so-called Facebook. Their media have been monitored and information handed over to the Zionist regime. There is an agreement actually by Facebook and the Zionist communication department. All these activities will be reported to the Israelis, and the Israelis will arrest the Palestinians. So Shireen will not be the last, and she's not the first. Sadly, she was actually killed by a sniper. It's obviously an assassination. The Zionists at the beginning denied their brutal act and their responsibility of killing her. Yet later, another Israeli human rights organization called B'Tselem shows on the footage that that time when Shireen was shot, with no resistance, was no any fight in the area. They seen her walking with her colleagues. The sniper shot her on the head, and for the next nearly 3 seconds, he was shooting and shot her colleague, who was lucky enough to survive. So it's not a strange act by the Zionists. This is the 56, we could give her the number 56 journalists being shot and killed in West Bank.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Mr. James Dolsey? Shireen has covered the brutality of the longest occupation. What was your initial reaction to her murder? And what's your guess on what Shireen meant beyond a journalist for so many Palestinians?
Well, obviously it was shock, maybe not surprise, grief. It also evokes memories of one's own experience as a correspondent for 4 decades in conflict situations, including Palestine, and memories, of course, of many others who've been killed, not only Palestinians, but across the globe. I think there are several points that one has to make here. While there is no doubt in my mind that she was killed by the Israelis. But beyond that, everything we are saying at the moment is we're assuming. There's no question in my mind of the validity of the witness statements. However, coming back to what John Phoenix said about B'Tselem said 2 things. They said clearly that they believed that Shireen was killed by an Israeli bullet, but there were Palestinian fighters in the area, and there was at one point, whether or not at the moment of the killing of Shireen or not, there was crossfire. Now, the only way that we're going to establish this, and the only way that we can capitalize on what was an Israeli public relations disaster in the way that they've handled this, is to take a step back. With other words, to leave our preconceptions aside and to push for an international investigation that independently establishes exactly what happened and lets the chips fall where they fall. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that Shireen's death obviously is in the context of the Israeli occupation, but it's also in the context of a worldwide situation in which journalists have become targets and in which journalists' lives are at greater risk than they have been in for a very long time.
And
so
speaking of journalists, Mr. James Dolsey, and according to right groups, the Zionists killed over 50 journalists since 2000. The year 2000, and injured 144 others just in the past 4 years alone. How do you find this number, and what is about press freedom?
I'm fully aware of those figures, and that's fine. The point here is that obviously Israeli policy is a policy that believes in collective punishment. It believes in force. It believes that is the language that Palestinians understand, all of which has proven to be wrong. It's a policy that's backfired. And I think that's the context in which we've got to look at Palestinian journalists being killed. They're being killed, in my mind, primarily as journalists, as Palestinians, rather than as journalists.
Mr. John Phoenix, this is not also the first time that the Zionists targeted Al Jazeera in particular. Last year, the network office in Gaza was bombed to rubble, while journalists covering the Zionist ethnic cleansing in Arab residents in occupied East al-Quds were also assaulted. The investigation that the Zionist authorities say they launched doesn't gain the trust of many rights groups. How can we achieve justice in such case scenarios?
Well, just to remind you that it's not the first time Al Jazeera office is being attacked. If you go back to the brutal criminal NATO attack on bombing of Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia, the Jazeera office was bombed because if you go back to even 1987, the first year of the Palestinian First Intifada, Shimon Peres himself said our main enemy is the camera. They want to commit the crimes, without the outside world witness their crimes. They fear, obviously, their reputation. I don't think they fear they will be attacked. They would present themselves to the world. They are the only so-called, in a bracket, the only democracy in the Middle East. There's the only brutal regime, actually, in the Middle East. I mean, just going back to assumption, a lot of people being local residents, being actually interviewed by the local media. None of these people said there was any clashes in the area. Now, with respect to my colleague here talking about international investigation, all international investigations include investigation regard to the Gaza potential war crimes was whitewashed by the international community. A lot of the United Nations envoys who actually attempt to attend investigation in Gaza was blocked by the Israelis. So we do not really, Palestinians do not really trust the international community because the international community is biased. Even the Americans saying this is a wrong act, but we will not condemn Israel. We don't have any trust on this so-called international community. A lot of cases been taken to the court and International Court of Justice, thrown in the rubbish. So it's clear that Israel do not care about international community. They was attacking even the funeral processions openly, under the international cameras. So they're sending message to the world that we can do whatever we want and heck with the world. So I don't think really any brutal act could be stopped by sending 2 or 3 so-called United Nations. The only response and the only way to restrain the Israelis is the public resistance to the Zionist regime.
And speaking of the funeral procession, Zionist police officers charged that Palestinian mourners carrying the coffin of Al Jazeera journalist SHIREEN Abu Akleh on Friday before thousands led her casket through Jerusalem's old city in an outpouring of grief and anger over her killing.
The US and EU led an international outcry Saturday after Zionist police officers assaulted mourners at the funeral procession of the prominent Palestinian-American journalist killed this week in the occupied West Bank, forcing pallbearers to nearly drop the coffin.
We've urged respect for the funeral procession, the mourners, and the family at this sensitive time. We're also in close touch with Israeli and Palestinian authorities, have been and obviously will continue to be, especially given the images we've seen today. We're not currently involved in any of the investigation, but we are working to bridge cooperation and available to provide assistance as needed.
Video showed police officers in Al-Quds beating and kicking pallbearers carrying the coffin that contained the body of SHIREEN Abu Akleh, striking other mourners with batons and forcing people to the ground. During the eruption, the pallbearers were pushed backward, causing them to briefly lose control of one end of the coffin. The incident occurred outside the hospital in occupied East Quds, where mourners had gathered to take the coffin of the Christian journalist to a nearby church for her funeral. The United States said it was deeply troubled by the scenes, while the European Union said it was appalled by the unnecessary force.
those images. They're obviously deeply disturbing. This is a day where we should all be marking, including everyone there, the memory of a remarkable journalist who lost her life. We know that there is, with the disturbing footage from the funeral procession today in Jerusalem, we regret the intrusion into what should have been a peaceful procession.
The funeral was attended by thousands of people and came a day after state memorial service was held in West Bank city of Ramallah. At the service, mourners stood at the courtyard of Palestinian Authority's presidential headquarters to praise and bid farewell to a person many Palestinians consider a trailblazing journalist. The United States, European Union, and United Nations have backed calls for a full investigation into Abu Akleh's killing. Grief over Abu Akleh's killing split beyond the Palestinian territories, while protests erupting in Turkey, Sudan, and elsewhere.
Let me get back to you, Mr. John Phoenix, since you mentioned the funeral procession. I mean, funerals are supposed to be a time of closure, a solid, peaceful time of mourning and reflections. However, Shireen Abu Akleh's funeral was the total opposite. How do you see this? Why further provocative acts by the Zionist part? Will there be accountability for this?
Well, look, the history of the conflict proved to us that the Israeli regime do not respect dead or alive. I mean, if you, just a reminder, they actually dig Palestinian graves, one cemetery being removed completely in Jerusalem to build a museum. They don't even have respect to the dead bodies of the Palestinians, you know. Obviously, it's an open, hostile policy toward the Palestinians. I mean, if you compare the language now, the spokesman for the so-called White House, if you compare the language, you know, between their act and the so-called Russia brutal invasion of Ukraine, a big different language, you know. This is a lip service to the Palestinians and to the world that the White House obviously not happy with the disturbed, not condemned, disturbed of the footages. What course of action are you going to take? Are there going to be any action, physical action, embargo, boycotting? There going to be any action? Of course not. This is not Ukraine. This is the Palestinian victims. And the criminals who actually commit this crime is the American partners. It is the military American imperialist post in the Middle East, which is their job to act and control the whole Middle East for the American imperialists. So I don't think the so-called disturbed such language is not actually enough. They had to take a true and real action in order to prevent the Zionists of killing Palestinian civilians and journalists. You know.
Very nice indeed. Mr. James Dorsey, do you think that what happened during her funeral reflects the brutality of the Zionist forces? And how likely is her death a deliberate act, according to you?
Let me say several things. First of all, I think we have to differentiate between an international investigation with whatever it concludes and what the international community does with it. The second thing, what the international community does with it, does not devalue the investigation. One of the things that we're seeing with the condemnations, and in my mind, I think that in some ways what happened at the funeral tarnished Israel's image far more, unfortunately, than the killing of Shireen herself. And what we're seeing is a gradual, it's a process, it's a drawn out process in which Israel's credibility and the legitimacy of its arguments is being chipped away against. And that is the process that's going to ultimately force change. And this is one important building block in it. I do want to say one thing in response to my colleague. Everything I hear from the Palestinians whom I speak to, as well as what I hear from Palestinians in the media, is a call for an international investigation. In fact, by adding the case of Shireen to the International Criminal Court case that's ongoing at the moment, is a call for an international investigation. So I think the insistence on an international investigation is the way that you're going to be able to capitalize on what happened as much as possible. In terms of the motives of the Israelis in attacking the funeral process, I think the Israelis are down a tunnel. Mm-hmm. Anybody who would have made a cost-benefit analysis would have concluded that it's far better to allow the procession to go forward, to allow the coffin to be carried by the mourners through the streets of Jerusalem, than the pictures of Israeli military beating up those that are the pallbearers.
Mr. James Dawsey, why do you think the Zionist state is insistent to carry the investigation? Isn't there an obvious purpose which is obscuring the truth for their brutality?
There's no way that you cannot conclude that the Israelis, let me put it differently. There are presumably two reasons why the Israelis resist an international investigation. One, they don't trust it. They have a bunker mentality in which they feel that international organizations are lined up against them. That's their feeling towards the United Nations, for example.
But it's the same feeling. The same feeling the Palestinians are holding.
Let me just finish. And the second issue is that if you were convinced of your case, then you would not be afraid of an international and independent investigation. Obviously, and you look at the progression of statements of Israel over the past week since Wednesday, the Israelis are not convinced of their case.
Mr. John Phoenix, what are your comments on what our distinguished guest just stated about the Israelis not trusting the international organizations, although you did mention earlier that they are biased toward Israel?
Well, if you look back to the history of the called investigations, this time the Israelis insisting to investigate the case themselves and want to include the Palestinian BA, the authority. Well, I think the reason they wanted the Abbas regime, which is, as we know, is a Zionist puppet, they wanted to have a stamp from the Palestinian Authority. They are actually innocent from the crime itself. Why, as my colleague said, why not allow the international community? Okay, well, I had obviously a feeling that the international community is not going to be achieving anything other than end up whitewash the Zionist crime. But let's say this is the case where we had to give them a chance. Why the Israelis refusing to allow international community? Not because they think that United Nations will be, US will be voting against Israel in the UN or condemning the Israelis, just because they wanted to be sure that the other parties, which is outside the Palestine, would not involve in exposing the case. A lot of the times where UN envoys wanted to enter Gaza, with mandate by United Nations to go to interrogate, interview cases of assassinations, of bombing civilian areas, the white phosphoric the Israelis used in Gaza, which is against the international law, Geneva Agreement. They refused to allow entry to those people because they're the bosses, and this case, there will be the same outcome. I don't know if you remember the report about Gaza, which is carried by the judge from South Africa. I forgot his name. He investigated the matter, and when he finished, he pulled out. He said, "I want to resign." He refused to actually submit the report because the pressure by United States. It's a gang system. It's a mafia running the United Nations. It's a mafia running the international law. Otherwise, as my colleague said, why not allow the international community, and impartial body from outside the world to investigate it without the involvement of the Israelis and even the Palestinians.
Very nice indeed. And now to talk about the event of the day, NAKBA Day, which each 15th of May commemorates the 750,000 Palestinians expelled with the so-called Israeli state's 1948 creation and those facing forced displacement today. It comes as Israeli forces shot dead veteran Palestinian journalist SHIREEN Abu Akleh, 51, as she covered a Zionist security raid in the occupied West Bank on Wednesday, before brutally assaulting mourners at her funeral on Friday. At least 15,000 protesters rallied in London on Saturday to demand justice for past and present Palestinian victims of Zionist violence and ethnic cleansing. And also, as a symbolic gesture, police in Berlin have banned a vigil in memory of Al Jazeera's journalist SHIREEN Abu Akleh, who was shot dead by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank. The event is one of a number of gatherings that have been forbidden by the authorities under an unprecedented and wide-ranging ban on pro-Palestinian protest in the German capital. Germany's Foreign Affairs Minister made a statement about the murder of Al Jazeera's veteran journalist. Let's listen.
So it is incredibly important to me, and we've made it very clear that her death should be explained in a transparent way. And it is even sadder that the funeral ceremony could not be held in peace and dignity. To be honest, I'm deeply shocked.
Mr. John Phoenix, are we expecting a change in the occupied Palestine? Will the Zionist entity halt their aggression towards the Palestinians? Are we going to see a resolution anytime soon? Hello, Mr. James, can you hear me? Seems that we don't have the voice of Phoenix, John
Hello?
Phoenix. Yes,
Hello?
yes, go ahead.
Activities and brutal crimes against the Palestinians, they should obviously have the United Nations forces to monitor the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, so they can be international force witnessing their crimes daily. Now they're killing Palestinians, they banning TVs and social media. They are secure in terms of committing their daily crimes. In terms of settlements and settlers, the time the Palestinians busy with the funeral of SHIREEN, the settlers in West Bank, in Hebron city in West Bank, they was actually invading homes and kicking the residents out and taking their homes. Mm-hmm. They had to be, instead of waiting for such a crime committed and asking for the international community to investigate it, they should have a United Nations peace force present and patrolling the area every day. Mm-hmm. Kids cannot go to school without being attacked by the settlers under the protection of the Israeli army. Most of the footage you could see, yes, settlers attacking students, children going to school, attacking shops, burning cars, the help and support of the Zionist army.
Mr. John Phoenix, yeah. So we know what's happening in the ground. We know the atrocities committed. But are you with a two-state solution? Do you think this is going to cut it? Are we going to close this thorny file between Palestine and the so-called Israel?
Such settlement, which is that much land, obviously been taking, and left obviously nothing as such, like a South African model, certain spots here and there. If you look at the map from 1948 till now, there is nothing left to the Palestinians to call a state. I think most of the Palestinians will obviously doubt that they're going to have a state. I think they should have one state, one vote, like South Africa.
Very nice indeed. Mr. James Dorsey, as a final word, how can the world help the Palestinians? It's the longest occupation in history. Brutal murders are happening there daily. We all know about the atrocities. But a two-state solution, are you for or against? And is this going to end it?
A two-state solution would be the ideal solution.
We don't have the voice of John Dorsey. Maybe the technical team can hear me. Do we have John Dorsey?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. a two-state solution would be the ideal solution under the circumstances. The problem is that the facts on the ground make that increasingly more difficult. With other words, you would have to either put 700,000 Israelis under Palestinian jurisdiction or move 700,000 Israelis, which is an almost impossible task, which leaves you with two possibilities: a one-state solution, one man, one vote, equal rights, or going back to something that was touted in the 1980s, which would be a tripartite solution. With other words, you create a Palestinian state, but at the same time you create a confederation that would include both Jordan, Palestine, and Israel, and it would allow the various communities to govern themselves, but there would be an overall confederate government, which would be Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli.
Very nice indeed. Thank you, dear John Dolce. Thank you, John Phoenix, for being with us and for sharing with us your analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.